Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends. And as always, I see you enemies. I am your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. And you're tuned in to the Dr. Muhammad Files, where we break down the real issues of the FBA community in a scholarly, civil, and unapologetically truthful way. This is episode 4 in our series, and today we're engaging chapter 4 of Dr. Feagin's pivotal work, the chapter entitled Black Counterframing Real Freedom, Justice, and Democracy. Throughout United States history, black history, foundational black Americans have been subjected to persistent oppression designed to keep them locked into a position of systemic inequality. From the Revolutionary era to the present, our people have been forced to resist, both individually and as a collective, against a society built on myths and lies upheld by a dominant white racial frame. While many white Americans have professed a belief in liberty and justice, their embrace of those ideals has often been hollow, reserved for rhetoric rather than actual redress. What do I mean by this? This hypocrisy becomes especially clear when we examine the lived reality of the foundational black American communities in contrast to white America's lofty claims of freedom, justice, and liberty. So, in response to centuries of dehumanization, foundational black Americans have forged a unique homegrown culture rooted in a justice centered morality. This is why, whenever you see people have issues, the Palestinians, the Israelis, the immigration, who do everyone come to? They come to the foundational black American community for support because they know that our unique homegrown culture is rooted in a justice centered morality and shaped by a rich ethnogenesis, blending black, aboriginal, red native, European, and African lineages, creating a unique people, foundational black Americans. Well, this culture identity has been a tool of survival, resistance, and truth telling. By exposing the contradictions between white America's proclaimed values and actions. We just came from Williamsburg, Virginia, where they had this big display, beautiful display of the history of America. Now, this was a beautiful thing. However, it was not true during that time that foundational black Americans had freedom, justice, and liberty as they were celebrating. They did a good job in some places of highlighting the enslaved foundational black Americans, of course, using the misnomer of African Americans. In fact, I checked one of the, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Williams Bray School in Williamsburg, Virginia, the first quote unquote African American school. Well, the curator was talking about um, this was to teach children of African descent. And then in the next sentence, she would say, the mulatto children. And I said, so the school not only taught children of African descent, but also mulatto children. And what about the children, the black melanated children who were here before slavery and were enslaved? And she was like, yeah. We just have to say, we're trying to keep up with the words of today, make sure that we're being politically correct. And she says, because some people, they don't use the word African American. I said, I know. I said, this is what my research is centered on, foundational black American delineation. But anyway, I digress. So FBA scholars and thinkers continue to challenge the legitimacy of the so-called American promise, highlighting the diversion, the denial, and double standards that have always surrounded the nation's treatment of black life. Well, this chapter dives deep into the black counterframing, real freedom, justice, and democracy. Let's get into it.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
Before we get started, FBA family, friends, and you enemies, I usually give a disclaimer if I remember. I want to make something clear for our listeners. Throughout this podcast, I'll be citing the work of Dr. Feagin, and you'll notice that sometimes he'll use the outdated and inaccurate misnomer of African American. I will only use that label when quoting them directly. Many of us, especially those of us who descend from U.S. chattel slavery, do not identify as African. I'll repeat that. We do not identify as African. We are foundational Black Americans or freedmen when it's for government purposes. And that distinction matters. Now, let's address one of the biggest myths in American history: the ideal that liberty, justice, and democracy were born out of the American Revolutionary War. Well, if you think about it, what was the condition? What was the status of foundational Black Americans? Although we did fight in the American Revolutionary War, what was our status? We were still enslaved. So white historical framing often promotes this narrative about freedom, the liberty, justice, and democracy, but it ignores the fact that foundational Black Americans fought in every war, including the Revolutionary War, without having our freedom recognized. It wasn't until much later that any notion of justice was extended to us, if at all. Some would argue that it still has not extended to us. So I contend that it was not the founding fathers who brought this country closer to a true democracy. It was us, our ancestors. It was foundational Black Americans who relentlessly demanded that America live up to its promises. As Dr. Feagin writes, since before the first American Revolution, African Americans have usually been the collective conscious and pride for the most significant racial changes to this white racist society. The largest group that whites utilized for centuries as highly exploited and enslaved labor. African Americans were the largest racially exploited group within the United States that was created in 1787, and the one that early on regularly petitioned and pressured the government for authentic liberty and justice for all. He continues, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, Black Americans were the ones that raised a vision of democracy in America, such as neither white Americans nor Europeans convinced in the 18th century as such as they have not even accepted in the 20th century. Very rarely outside communities have African Americans gotten credit for these counterframing efforts, forcefully pressing this country well beyond its racially totalitarian institutions of slavery and Jim Crow toward a much freer and more democratic society. In short, family, friends, and you enemies, it has been foundational black Americans, not the architects of the Constitution, who have most consistently challenged this nation to live up to its own ideals. While our constitutions have often been ignored or erased, or I should say, our contributions have often been ignored or erased, they remain the moral background of every meaningful push toward real democracy. With that in mind, let's now pivot to the core ideological struggle that shapes this reality. White framing and the powerful tradition of black counterframing. Now, as we move into this next section, white framing, black counterframing, we dig deeper into the ideological battle that has shaped American history. Dr. Feagin, he highlights how the white racial frame has long been embedded in the nation's founding documents. He writes, it appears in founding documents such as in the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence and the establish justice and secure the blessings of liberty rhetoric of the U.S. Constitution. Liberty, freedom, equality, and justice were terms used occasionally or often by the white framers of the U.S. Constitution. Yet, Feagin reminds us that these lofty ideals were undermined from the beginning. He says, remarkably, these and other whites professed statements about liberty were strongly contradicted by their extensive oppression of indigenous people and enslaved Africans. From the Revolutionary era to the present, most whites have accepted some version of this liberty and justice frame, but usually one that is only rhetorical and hypocritical when it comes to the seriously addressing system racial oppression, seriously redressing systemic racial oppression. But where there is white framing, there has always been resistance. We are a people of resistance and always have been. I say we, foundational black Americans. So Dr. Feagin, he goes on to explain that black Americans were among the first to mount a sustained intellectual and moral counter frame. He states, black Americans were arguably the first major group within the European colonies and later the United States to widely utilize an extensive counterframe to combat the white racial frame and other aspects of systemic racism. For example, in the form of thousands of black authored pamphlets, books, speeches, and conventions. One major reason for this, as Francis Adams and Barry Sanders has emphasized, is whites' exclusion of black Americans from access to full citizenship's right for most of this country's history. Don't forget that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were specifically for foundational black Americans, not for anybody else coming to seek economic gain here. I digress. And most critically, he affirms the enduring roles of foundational black Americans' resistance. He says, Dr. Feagin, the large scale recurring resistance and counterframing of black pamphleteers, abolitionists, Civil War soldiers, and civil rights activists have been critical factors in the significant progress this country has made in implementing, if still only partially, its much heralded ideals of freedom, justice, and democracy. Indeed, most black Americans have sought much more than civil rights. They have worked and protested to secure full citizenship and full democratic participation in all major aspects of a truly democratic society. So when immigrants come here and they display anti-black rhetoric, they should remember that it's only because of foundational black American resistance that they even have the right to get full citizenships, especially those who are melanated from Africa and the Caribbean. But in short, while while white elites constructed a framework of liberty and language, well, it was foundational black Americans who gave those words meaning through lived resistance, moral clarity, and an unrelenting demand for justice. And again, I said this earlier, but this is why when groups have an issue with the government, they come to foundational black Americans who have the moral clarity and unrelenting demand for justice throughout history. So, with that foundation laid, we now turn to the deeper historical reality beyond the myths of white authorship and examine the true architects of democracy in the next section, which is entitled White Framers, Black Founders. So the section titled White Framers and Black Founders, it's a necessary disruption of the traditional historical narrative that's always or that is oftentimes projected by uh, white scholars, even liberal scholars. Dr. Joe Feagin, he makes it clear that while the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is supposedly granted Americans the right to petition the government for redress, right? The white male leadership of the early republic consistently denied the right to black people. He writes, in spite of the new U.S. Constitution's First Amendment right of Americans to petition the government for redress of grievances, the all white male Congress ignored or rejected numerous anti slavery and pro freedom petitions it received in its first decades. Some of the most fervent petitions were from free African Americans. So this wasn't a case of oversight, it was a deliberate act by the so called white founding fathers. The white leadership of the so called land of the free, it had no intention of applying those ideals universally. So we keep that in mind. Although we have fought for our rights, it wasn't, the founding fathers did not have us in mind when they said liberty, justice, democracy. Feagin continues, most white legislators work to suppress efforts by all African Americans to petition the country's legislators for their freedom. Not one major white political leader envisioned a truly democratic country in which not only white men could vote and hold office, but the majority of Americans, women, black Americans, Native Americans would have political, social, and economic equality. This points to a deeper truth. The very foundation of the United States was built on exclusion. I'll say that again. The foundation of the United States was built on exclusion. How do we know that? Because we know during the time of the Constitution, the writing of the Constitution, the Revolutionary War, that foundational black Americans were enslaved. While the white framers were writing freedom into law, they were simultaneously denying that freedom to millions of foundational black Americans. So the real push for democracy, it didn't come from the top, it came from the bottom as most resistance often do. It came from the resistance, the sacrifice, and leadership of foundational black Americans. Dr. Feagin goes on to summarize, whites have oppressed African Americans and other Americans of color to keep them in their societal place of extreme inequality. Thus, over the course of the United States history, these Americans have had to engage in individual and group struggles against oppression and its mythologizing white frame. He also cites scholars C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya, who observed that while the definition of freedom has evolved for black Americans, freedom from bondage during slavery, freedom to move and be educated after emancipation, and later demands for social, political, and economic justice in the 20th century, there has always been a shared moral core. As Dr. Feagin puts it, there has always been a common core that is distinctive and communally oriented. So, FBA family and friends, this enduring moral core rooted in community, justice, and resilience has been the true engine of American democracy, right? The founding forefathers, so-called forefathers, they put it to paper, but it was foundational black Americans who pushed for true democracy. While the nation's founding documents it promoted liberty, it has been the unyielding struggle of those excluded from that promise who have most faithfully pursued its fulfillment. So the story of the United States is not only one of exclusion, but of a people who, against all odds, right? As the great poet and resistance fighter Tupac Shakur said, against all odds, redefined freedom, and it reshaped the nation in their image. So, in conclusion, FBA family, friends, and I'm sure you enemies still lingering, what this section makes clear is that the so called founding fathers penned freedom into theory, but it was foundational black Americans who fought to make it a reality. It is our ancestors, not theirs, who laid the moral and democratic groundwork for this country. This country belongs to us. We have to stop saying that or thinking that this country only belongs to white Europeans. We are the true founders of any America that dares to claim liberty and justice. So join us next time as we continue breaking down Dr. Feagin's powerful analysis. Until then, question everything, think critically, and don't fall for the okey doke. Resist the comfort of false histories. Because, as Chairman Fred Hampton said, you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. Because while the so called founding fathers wrote freedom into theory, it was foundational black Americans who made it real. So share this truth, speak it boldly, and be part of the ongoing fight for justice. The fight for FBA recognition is far from over, but through education, activism, and self determination, we will reclaim our rightful place in history. Our ancestors built this nation brick by brick, law by law, institution by institution. And now it is our duty to secure the justice, wealth, and legacy they were denied. The future of foundational black Americans' empowerment is in our hands, and together we will reshape it. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. Please like the podcast, share it, subscribe, and donate, as I will be adding a donation link soon, if not on this one. Signing off, your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. And these are the Dr. Muhammad Files.